Picture a river the color of rust, thick as syrup, the smell of iron and rot rising off the water in waves. Fish floating belly up by the thousands, washing onto banks already crowded with the bodies of yesterday's catch. And the people of Egypt, the most powerful civilization on earth, kneeling at the edge of that river, digging frantic holes in the wet sand with their bare hands, praying for a few drops of water that haven't turned to blood yet. This is not a horror film. This is Tuesday morning in the most advanced nation on the planet 3,000 years ago. And it is only the first of 10 times this will happen. Here's what should bother you. An empire that built the pyramids, that mapped the stars, that ruled the known world for centuries, gets brought to its knees not by an army, not by a rival king, but by 10 plagues that arrive in an order so precise, so deliberate, that historians have spent generations trying to explain it as coincidence. They have failed. Because once you see the pattern hiding inside these 10 plagues, you will never read the book of Exodus the same way again. Now, what's remarkable here is the world this story is set inside. Egypt in the days of Moses wasn't a backward kingdom waiting to be conquered. It was the superpower of its age. Massive temple complexes, a bureaucracy that could organize the labor of hundreds of thousands of people. A religious system so deeply woven into daily life that the Nile itself, the river that gave Egypt its food, its trade routes, its very existence, was worshipped as a god. And into that empire walks a man who, by every visible measure, should have no leverage at all. Moses isn't a general. He has no army behind him, no political office, no wealth, no royal blood that Pharaoh would recognize. He's a former shepherd, a fugitive who fled this same country decades earlier after killing an Egyptian overseer, returning now with nothing but a wooden staff and a message: "Let my people go." Pharaoh's answer is almost bored. "Who is this God of yours that I should listen to him?" That single sentence, recorded in Exodus 5, verse 2, is the real opening line of this entire story. Pharaoh doesn't reject the request because he's evaluated the evidence and found it lacking. He rejects it because in his mind, there is no God greater than the gods Egypt already worships. He himself is considered divine, the living embodiment of Horus on earth, holding both the religious and political authority of the entire nation in a single throne. His theology has never been seriously challenged, and nothing in his experience has prepared him to imagine that it ever could be. So here's the unanswered question this video is going to resolve. Why 10? Why not one overwhelming miracle, one act of power so total that Pharaoh has no choice but to surrender immediately? Why does God choose a sequence, a slow, escalating, almost theatrical unfolding of 10 distinct disasters, each one announced in advance, each one given time to land, each one met with the same hardened refusal? It's worth sitting with how strange that choice actually is. If you were writing this story and you wanted to demonstrate overwhelming, unmistakable power, the most efficient narrative choice would be a single, instantaneous act, one plague, total devastation, immediate surrender. Instead, what we get is something closer to a courtroom than a battlefield. 10 separate hearings, 10 separate verdicts, 10 separate opportunities for the defendant to change his plea. That structure alone tells you this story isn't really about raw power at all. It's about something closer to due process, a God who could simply overwhelm, choosing instead to repeatedly confront, repeatedly warn, and repeatedly wait. And there's a reason the timing matters as much as it does. Exodus 12, verse 40 tells us the Israelites had been in Egypt for 430 years by this point. Over 4 centuries of slowly tightening bondage, generations born and dying without ever knowing freedom. This isn't a rescue that arrives the week trouble starts. It's a rescue that arrives after 400 years of silence from Israel's perspective. And yet, once it begins, unfolds with a precision that suggests nothing about the timing was ever actually random. The text doesn't judge Pharaoh's choices. It simply shows us what happened and invites us to understand why this story unfolds exactly the way it does. And once we walk through these 10 plagues in order, The answer becomes impossible to miss. Plague 1. Blood. Exodus 7:14-25. The first plague begins with a question Pharaoh himself doesn't realize he's answering. God instructs Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, the rivers, the canals, the ponds, even the water stored in jars inside people's homes, and they will become blood." Now, here's where the original language adds a layer most readers miss entirely. Your English Bible says the waters were turned into blood, full stop. But the Hebrew text in Exodus 7:19 uses the word mikveh to describe the gathered waters, the same word used in Genesis 1:10, where God gathers the waters of the earth and calls the gathering seas. This is not a coincidental word choice. The author is deliberately echoing the language of creation itself. What God once called into order at the beginning of the world, he is now unmaking one plague at a time in the land that dared to call a river divine. And that detail matters more than it first appears, because the Nile wasn't just a water source to the Egyptians, it was worshipped as the god Hapi, bringer of fertility and abundance, the very bloodstream of the nation. The annual Nile flood was so central to Egyptian survival that pharaohs built their entire administrative calendar around it. And priests performed elaborate rituals each year begging Hapi for a flood, generous enough to feed the population, but not so violent it would destroy the villages along its banks. When that river turns to blood, God isn't simply causing inconvenience. He is walking directly into Egypt's holiest sanctuary and contaminating it in front of everyone, turning the very thing Egypt depended on for life into something undrinkable, something dead. Pharaoh's magicians respond by performing the same trick on a smaller scale, turning a little of the remaining clean water to blood as well, which, if you stop and think about it, doesn't disprove Moses' God at all. It just makes the water shortage worse. Notice what the magicians never do throughout this entire first plague. They never reverse it. They can imitate destruction, they cannot produce restoration. That asymmetry, the ability to copy judgment but never to undo it, becomes one of the quiet, recurring tells throughout this whole account. Pharaoh's heart, the text says, remains hard. 7 days pass, nothing changes. Plague 2. Frogs. Exodus 8:26-15. Then come the frogs, and this is where the pattern of escalation starts to reveal itself, because frogs aren't random either. Egypt worshipped a goddess named Heket, depicted with the head of a frog, associated with fertility and childbirth, believed to assist in the very breath of life entering a newborn. Egyptian women sometimes wore amulets bearing her image during pregnancy, asking for her protection during labor. The Nile produces frogs every year as part of its flooding cycle. Egyptians considered this a sign of blessing, a visible promise that the coming season would be fertile and abundant. So, when frogs erupt from every gathering of water in numbers beyond counting, climbing into bedrooms, ovens, kneading troughs, the symbol of fertility and blessing becomes a plague of suffocating excess. The very thing Egypt celebrated as divine provision becomes unbearable in its overabundance. There's something almost poetic in that, and devastating. The thing you worship taken to the point of horror. A goddess of childbirth and protection mocked by an infestation she's powerless to stop or even explain. This time, Pharaoh cracks slightly. He asks Moses to pray for the frogs to be removed, and he actually promises, to let the people go. Moses agrees. God removes the frogs, and then Exodus 8:15 tells us something we need to sit with. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart. Take a moment with this. The relief itself becomes the reason for the hardening. Not punishment, not more suffering. Relief. The moment the pressure lifts, Pharaoh's resolve returns, and the promise evaporates. Plague 3. Gnats/lice. Exodus 8:16-19. The third plague closes out this first triad, and it's the one where something shifts. God tells Moses to strike the dust of the ground, and the dust becomes swarms of gnats, covering man and beast across the entire land. This time, Pharaoh's magicians try to replicate it and cannot. The text says plainly, but they could not. For the first time, Egypt's spiritual power structure hits a wall it cannot climb over. And this is the moment the pattern starts to speak for itself. Instance 1, blood. Interesting, even alarming, but explainable as an isolated disaster. Instance 2, frogs. Now a pattern is forming, because frogs strike at a specific god Egypt worships. Instance 3, gnats. When even Egypt's own sorcerers admit defeat, the pattern is undeniable. This isn't random catastrophe, this is a targeted dismantling of an entire belief system, one piece at a time. And the people closest to that system are the first ones forced to admit it. God told Moses back in Exodus 7:5 exactly what this first set of plagues was for. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. Not Pharaoh's gods, not the Nile, not Heket, the Lord. 3 plagues, 3 confrontations, 1 purpose, establishing beyond magical trickery or coincidence exactly who is speaking. Now, step back from Egypt for a moment, because there's something underneath this first triad that has nothing to do with ancient history. How many times in your own life have you held on to something, a habit, a relationship, a version of yourself, and gotten just enough relief, just enough breathing room to convince yourself nothing actually needs to change? Pharaoh's hardened heart in Exodus 8:15 isn't a uniquely ancient problem. It's one of the most human patterns there is. The moment the pressure lifts, we forget how badly we needed to change in the first place. You don't have to be a tyrant ruling an empire to recognize that feeling. Maybe it was a health scare that faded once the test results came back fine, and the gym membership you swore you'd use sat untouched again. Maybe it was a relationship you promised to repair the moment things got hard, and then, the second the tension eased, you let the promise quietly dissolve. The text doesn't condemn Pharaoh for being uniquely evil. It shows us a pattern that lives in every human heart, and it invites us to ask whether relief has ever made us forget what we swore we'd do differently. If the first 3 plagues answered the question, who is the Lord, the second triad answers something different. Does this God actually control what happens, or is this just a string of unfortunate accidents? Plague 4, flies/wild animals, Exodus 8:20-32. The 4th plague introduces something new, and this is the detail historians who try to explain away these plagues as natural disasters always struggle with. God sends swarms. The Hebrew word here is arav, which can be translated as flies or as a mixed swarm of wild creatures, but whichever way it's rendered, what matters is what God says immediately before sending it. In Exodus 8:22-23, God tells Moses to tell Pharaoh something extraordinary. I will set apart the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms shall be there, so that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the land. Read that again. Not, the plague will probably miss them. Not, they'll be spared because they're far away. God explicitly draws a boundary line in advance through the middle of a single country, and the swarm respects that line exactly. Goshen, where the Israelites live, is untouched. Every other region drowns in chaos. This is what the text actually shows us. A natural disaster doesn't know where Israelite property ends and Egyptian property begins. A targeted judgment does. The 4th plague isn't simply more severe than the first 3, it's evidence. Evidence that whatever is happening in Egypt is being directed, not merely permitted. Plague 5, livestock pestilence, Exodus 9:1-7. The 5th plague strikes the cattle, horses, donkeys, camels, sheep, and goats of Egypt with a severe pestilence, and once again, Goshen is spared, the text repeating the same pattern of separation. This plague targets Apis, the sacred bull god of Egypt, along with Hathor, the cow-headed goddess associated with motherhood and protection. The animals Egypt elevated to divine status are the animals now dying in the fields. There's a brutal economic dimension here too that's easy to miss reading quickly. Cattle in the ancient world weren't pets. They were the entire agricultural and military infrastructure of a nation. Wealth, transportation, food security, sacrificial worship. Egypt is watching its actual capacity to function as a civilization erode in real time. And still, the text says plainly, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not let the people go. Plague 6, Boils, Exodus 9, 8-12. The sixth plague closes this second triad, and it's the most physically intimate one yet. Moses and Aaron take handfuls of soot from a furnace and toss it into the air, and it becomes festering boils breaking out on people and animals across the land. This plague targets Sekhmet, the lioness-headed goddess associated with disease and healing, and possibly Imhotep, deified as a god of medicine. The very deities Egyptians would have prayed to for relief from sickness become powerless in the face of the sickness itself. And there's a particular cruelty in the choice of imagery here, because the soot used to bring on the plague comes from a furnace, the same kind of furnace the Israelites themselves had been forced to tend as slaves making bricks. The ash of their own forced labor becomes the instrument of judgment against the nation that enslaved them. And here's where the text gives us a detail that should stop you cold. Exodus 9:11 says, "The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils." The same magicians who replicated the plague of blood, who tried and failed to replicate gnats, are now physically unable to even appear in Pharaoh's court. The architects of Egypt's spiritual resistance are sidelined entirely, not defeated in an argument, but incapacitated in their own flesh. Second triad complete. Instance 4, flies, with the explicit boundary drawn through Goshen, undeniable direction. Instance 5, livestock, striking the literal economic and spiritual backbone of the nation. Instance 6, boils, removing even the magicians from the conversation entirely. The pattern doesn't just escalate in severity, it escalates in precision. Each plague proves not just that God is powerful, but that God is sovereign over the smallest details: who gets touched, who doesn't, and who gets to keep arguing back. If you've ever wondered whether God actually sees the specific details of your life, not just the big picture, but the granular, particular reality you're living inside right now, this is the section of Exodus that answers that question with force. The line drawn around Goshen wasn't a general statement of care for Israel as an abstract idea. It was a precise geographic, household-by-household distinction. Your house, not that one. Your field, not that one. There's something deeply important in that level of specificity, because most of us, in our hardest seasons, don't actually doubt that God exists in some general sense. We doubt that He's paying attention to the particular thing we're going through, the diagnosis, the conversation we're dreading, the bill we can't pay this month. The line drawn through Goshen says the opposite is true. The God who can direct swarms of insects to within inches of a property line is not a God of vague, distant concern. He is a God who works in specifics. And if He drew that kind of precise boundary for an enslaved nation 3,000 years ago, the text invites you to consider whether the details of your life are really as invisible to Him as they sometimes feel. Plague 7. Hail. Exodus 9:13-35. The seventh plague opens with something the previous 6 did not have. God explains, through Moses, exactly why He's doing this. Exodus 9:14 records the Lord saying, "This time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and your officials and your people, so you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth." Hail mixed with fire falls across Egypt, destroying crops, livestock left out in the fields, even people who didn't heed the warning to take shelter. The Hebrew text describes a literal collision of opposing elements, fire traveling inside ice, falling from the sky in a way ancient observers would have understood as physically impossible. Jewish tradition later reflected on this strange combination, picturing fire and hail as natural enemies who had been forced to an uneasy alliance for the sake of a single mission, like two rival armies temporarily united under one king's command. This plague targets Nut, the sky goddess, and Set, god of storms, deities meant to control precisely this kind of weather event. Instead, the sky itself becomes the weapon against the gods who supposedly governed it. And here's something the text does that's easy to rush past. Exodus 9:20-21 tells us that some of Pharaoh's own officials this time believed the warning and brought their livestock and servants inside before the storm hit. Not everyone in Egypt is uniformly hardened. Some, even within Pharaoh's own court, are starting to separate themselves from his stubbornness. The plague doesn't just divide Egypt from Israel, it begins dividing Egypt from itself. Plague 8. Locusts. Exodus 10, verses 1-20. The eighth plague brings locusts so dense they cover the face of the land, consuming every plant the hail left standing. This is the plague where Pharaoh's own officials finally turn on him directly. Exodus 10:7 records them asking Pharaoh outright, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go." His own government is now begging him to stop. He partially relents, agrees to let the men go but not their families, a half measure Moses refuses because partial obedience to God's instruction was never actually obedience at all. The locusts target Senahem, a minor deity associated with protection from pests, but more broadly, they obliterate the very category of agricultural security Egypt depended on for survival. There is, after this plague, almost nothing green left standing anywhere in the land. Plague 9. Darkness. Exodus 10:21-29. The ninth plague is in some ways the most theologically loaded of all 10 because it strikes directly at Ra, the sun god, the central supreme deity of the entire Egyptian pantheon, the god Pharaoh himself was believed to descend from and to embody on earth. For 3 days, Exodus 10:22 says, there was thick darkness in all the land of Egypt, darkness so total that people could not see one another and did not rise from where they sat. But notice the line the text draws immediately after. Exodus 10:23, yet all the Israelites had light in the place where they lived, not just safety from harm like the boundary around Goshen in the earlier plagues, light. While the supreme god of Egypt's entire religious system fails to produce visible light across his own nation, the God of Israel produces light inside Israelite homes without the sun's help at all. Third triad complete. Instance 7, hail, dividing even Pharaoh's court against him. Instance 8, locusts, his own officials begging him to surrender. Instance 9, darkness, striking the supreme sun god directly and proving light itself doesn't depend on him. There is none like me in all the earth. That's not a boast made before the plague started. By the time you reach plague 9, it's simply an observed fact that even Pharaoh's own government can no longer deny. Here's something that deserves its own pause before we move to the 10th and final plague, because the echoes of these 9 disasters don't stay buried in ancient Egypt. Centuries later, the book of Revelation describes a final sequence of judgments poured out on the earth. Water turned to blood, painful sores breaking out on those who reject God, darkness covering a kingdom, hail and fire falling from the sky. The vocabulary is unmistakably borrowed. Revelation isn't inventing a new symbolic language for divine judgment. It's deliberately reaching back to Egypt, reusing the same images, as though the plagues poured out on Pharaoh were never simply a one-time historical event, but a kind of template, a pattern God returns to whenever empires built on false worship refuse, again and again, to let his people go. And here is where it gets remarkable. In the same way Pharaoh hardened his heart through 9 separate opportunities to repent, Revelation 9:20-21 describes people who, after watching plague after plague unfold, still refuse to turn. The text using almost identical language about hearts that will not soften no matter how much evidence accumulates. The pattern wasn't contained to one Egyptian king 3,000 years ago. It became, in the text's own telling, a recurring signature of how God confronts entrenched power, patiently, repeatedly, and visibly. right up until the final and most decisive judgment of all. Here's something worth pausing on, because it sharpens everything you've just seen. Nowhere in these 9 plagues does the text say God forced Pharaoh to refuse. 6 times Exodus tells us God hardened Pharaoh's heart. 3 times it tells us Pharaoh hardened his own heart. 5 times it simply says the heart was hardened without naming who did it. The text doesn't resolve that tension for us, and it doesn't need to. What it refuses to say is just as important as what it says. It never shows Pharaoh as a puppet with no will of his own, dragged through 9 disasters against every instinct in his body. His own officials warn him. His own magicians fail in front of him, and still every single time he chooses the same response. The text doesn't give us a simple villain being controlled from the outside. It gives us a man whose own hardness becomes, eventually, the very thing he is judged by. The 10th plague, the firstborn. 9 plagues, 9 confrontations, and Pharaoh, somehow, is still on his throne, which brings us to the moment everything in this story has been building toward, and the moment where the entire structure of the narrative changes completely. Exodus 11:4-6 records Moses delivering the final warning, "At midnight the Lord will pass through the land of Egypt, and every firstborn will die, from Pharaoh's own son on the throne to the firstborn of the lowest servant, even the firstborn of the livestock." This is the plague targeting not a single deity, but Pharaoh himself directly, the man who was worshipped as the literal embodiment of divinity, the one supposedly entitled to call himself a god on earth, now told that his own household is not exempt from death. But here is where the original Hebrew offers one of the most important word reveals in this entire account. Your English Bible calls this event the Passover, but the Hebrew word is Pesach, which doesn't simply mean to skip past the way we sometimes imagine, as if God's judgment simply hops over certain houses at random. The verb describes a protective stance, to hover over, to guard, to stand between. Some Hebrew scholars connect it to the image of a bird sheltering its young beneath outstretched wings during a storm, rather than the image of something casually stepping over an obstacle on the ground. God isn't passively skipping Israelite homes. He is actively standing between the judgment and the household marked by blood. And the instructions for that marking matter more than they first appear. Exodus 12:7-9 tells the Israelites to take the blood of a lamb and put it on the 2 side posts and on the lintel of the doorframe, top, left, right. 3 points of blood framing every doorway in Israel. This was not random ritual. It was a specific, deliberate mark applied to every single home that wanted to be found by the angel of death and passed over, rather than struck. And the instructions didn't stop at the doorframe. The family was told to eat the lamb that same night, fully dressed, sandals on their feet, staff in hand, ready to leave the moment the word came, a meal eaten standing at the edge of a future none of them could see yet, trusting a deliverance that hadn't happened yet. And here is where it gets remarkable. Centuries later, the Gospel writers describe Jesus dying at the exact time of year when lambs were being slaughtered for Passover, in the very city where this ritual had been observed annually for over 1,000 years. 1 Corinthians 5:7 calls Jesus directly, "our Passover lamb." John's Gospel even records that unlike the other prisoners crucified that day, Jesus' legs were not broken, echoing the instruction in Exodus 12:46 that the Passover lamb's bones must not be broken. This connection was not accidental, it was structural, embedded into Israel's calendar of worship more than 1,000 years before a cross stood outside Jerusalem. After the 10th plague, Exodus 12:30 tells us there was not a house in Egypt without someone dead, and a great cry went up across the entire land. Pharaoh, who watched 9 plagues fail to break him, finally summons Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night and tells them to leave, to take everything and go. There's something in the structure of that final plague that reaches far beyond ancient Egypt, and it's worth sitting with honestly. The families who survived that night weren't spared because they were morally superior to their Egyptian neighbors, They weren't spared because of how hard they had worked, or how well they had behaved, or how convincing their prayers were. They were spared because they trusted a specific instruction and applied a specific mark, blood on a doorframe, that had nothing to do with their own merit and everything to do with their obedience to what they'd been told to do. If you have ever felt like your standing with God depends on how good you've managed to be this week, this is the part of the story written directly for you. The blood on the doorpost wasn't a reward for righteousness. It was protection offered freely, received simply by trusting the instruction and acting on it. Imagine being an Israelite parent that night, exhausted, frightened, listening to the cries beginning outside in the Egyptian homes around you, having no proof yet that the blood on your own doorframe had actually worked. The mark didn't remove the fear. It simply held against it. That's worth remembering the next time you're waiting on a promise you can't yet see fulfilled. The absence of visible proof isn't the same thing as the absence of protection. The judgment that swept through Egypt that night didn't ask who deserved to live. It asked who was marked. Now, step back and look at all 10 plagues laid out together, because there's a hidden sequence here that most readers never notice. The plagues aren't simply a random list of disasters increasing in severity. Scholars studying the structure of this account have noticed they fall into a deliberate pattern. 3 sets of 3, each introduced with a specific lesson, followed by one final decisive plague that stands entirely alone. Blood, frogs, gnats. First triad, establishing who the Lord is. Flies, livestock, boils. Second triad, establishing that this God directs events with precision down to a property line. Hail, locusts, darkness. Third triad, establishing that there is none like him, even striking the supreme sun god directly. And then, standing apart from all 9, the 10th plague, the firstborn, striking not a symbol of a god, but the place where life itself begins, and Pharaoh's own household along with it. Read the targets of these 10 plagues in order, and the narrative is unmistakable. Hapi, the river god, falls first, the source of life and provision. Hecate, goddess of fertility, falls second. Geb, the earth god, falls third, as the very dust of the ground turns against Egypt. Every step downward strikes deeper into what Egypt depended on to survive: water, fertility, ground, animals, health, sky, harvest, sun, and finally, life itself passing from one generation to the next. The plagues don't simply punish Egypt randomly. They dismantle, piece by piece, in descending order, every layer of the religious and economic foundation the empire stood on. By the time you reach Plague 10, there is nothing left standing for Pharaoh to worship, govern, or inherit. There's a structural detail in this sequence that's easy to miss on a first reading, but becomes obvious once you notice it. The first 2 plagues in each triad come with advance warning, and the third comes without any warning at all. Blood and frogs are announced. Gnats arrive in silence. Flies and livestock are announced. Boils arrive in silence. Hail and locusts are announced. Darkness arrives in silence. It's almost as though God is teaching Pharaoh a rhythm. Warning, warning, that a sudden consequence with no announcement. Training him to recognize that the silent plagues are not random either. They are simply what happens when the warned ones are ignored long enough. Pharaoh, by the 9th plague, has had every opportunity to learn that rhythm. He never does. Same God, same purpose, every single time. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, not as an isolated event in Plague 1, as the conclusion every single plague was building toward, until even Pharaoh's own mouth was forced to admit it by sending Israel away.
So what does an ancient sequence of plagues against a forgotten empire have to do with the life you're living right now? Maybe it's this. Most of us don't experience God's patience as 10 plagues. We experience it as 10 quiet warnings, a conversation we avoided, a relationship we let drift, a habit we kept promising ourselves we'd address after this season calms down. Pharaoh wasn't given 1 chance, he was given 10. Spaced out, each one announced ahead of time, each one giving him room to change course before the next one arrived. The God of this story isn't a God who strikes first and explains later. He's a God who warns first, again and again, far longer than most of us would have the patience to wait. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable part of this whole account. It would be easier in some ways if Pharaoh had simply been crushed instantly. A single, overwhelming display of power that removed his choice entirely. Instead, the text shows us 9 separate opportunities to turn, 9 moments where relief could have become repentance instead of just relief. Think about how many of those moments looked, from the inside, like victories for Pharaoh. The frogs stopped. The flies lifted. The hail ended. Life on the surface returned to something resembling normal. It's easy to mistake the absence of immediate consequence for the absence of a problem. Easy to assume that because the pressure lifted, the warning must not have been that serious after all. Pharaoh made that mistake 9 times in a row, and each time, the cost of the next plague was higher than the one before it. If you're in a season right now where you sense something needs to change, in a relationship, in a habit, in the direction of your life, this story isn't asking whether you'll get another warning. Most of us, statistically, will get more chances than we deserve, the same way Pharaoh did. The question this story actually asks is sharper than that. What will you do differently the next time the pressure lifts and you feel that brief, deceptive sense of relief? Will you mistake it for resolution, the way Pharaoh did 9 separate times? Or will you recognize it for what it actually is? A pause, not a conclusion, and an invitation to finally let go of whatever you've been holding on to far longer than you should have. If walking through these 10 plagues in order has shown you something in this story you'd never noticed before, the best way you can help someone else discover it too is by subscribing and leaving a comment below. Even just a single word helps more than you'd think. And if you've made it this far, sitting through every plague, every word reveal, every uncomfortable pivot, you clearly care about what the text actually says, not just the version of the story you grew up hearing in passing, in a children's book, or in a movie that smoothed over all the hard edges. That matters, and I'm glad you're here for it. There's an old door in a museum exhibit reconstructing an ancient Egyptian home, wood worn smooth by centuries, the frame still bearing faint discoloration where something was once smeared across the top and down both sides. No placard explains it. No tour guide stops there. Most visitors walk past without a second look, because it just looks like an old stained piece of wood. But that stain was once the difference between a house visited by death and a house passed over by it. It cost nothing to apply except trust in an instruction that made no logical sense. Blood on a door, stopping an angel. And it worked, not because the blood itself was powerful, but because of the God who said it would be. 10 plagues, 3 triads, 1 purpose, and all of it converging on a single ordinary object, a doorframe, the kind every household has, the kind you walk through without thinking twice, transformed for one night into the line between judgment and mercy. Every door in your life that you've walked through unharmed, every threshold you've crossed into another day, somewhere behind that ordinary, unremarkable wood, there has always been a mark. You may have never noticed it. It was never about you noticing. It was about it being there.